In 1928, the Soviet Union was still, by most measures, a peasant country. Roughly 4 out of 5 people lived in the countryside, farming with wooden plows on land that had barely been mechanized since before the revolution. 13 years later, that same country built more tanks than Nazi Germany, evacuated an entire industrial base 1,000 miles east of the front line under artillery fire, and kept fighting until it took Berlin. 16 years after that, it put the first satellite into orbit. This is the paradox at the center of everything you're about to hear. A country too poor to reliably feed its own cities in 1921 became, within one human lifetime, one of only 2 powers on Earth capable of ending civilization. How does an economy do that? And if it could do that, why did it collapse almost overnight in 1991? Not from war, not from invasion, but from its own internal exhaustion? The answer isn't ideology, it's mechanics. The Soviet Union built a specific machine for turning human labor and raw material into state power, and understanding how that machine actually worked gear by gear is the only way to understand both its terrifying successes and the failure that eventually swallowed it whole. Start with the wreckage the Bolsheviks were sitting on after they seized power in 1917 and then fought a civil war to keep it. Lenin's government responded to that war with a set of emergency measures historians call war communism, the nationalization of all large industry, a state monopoly on trade, and, most consequentially, prodrazvyorstka, the forced requisitioning of grain from the peasantry. Armed brigades went village to village and took whatever surplus grain they could find above a bare subsistence minimum to feed the Red Army and the cities. The logic was survival in wartime. The result was catastrophe. Peasants responded exactly the way you'd expect anyone to respond to having their harvest confiscated. They stopped growing more than they needed for themselves. Sown acreage collapsed. By 1921, according to Britannica, industrial production had fallen to roughly 1/5 of its 1913 level, and combined with a severe drought, the requisitioning left millions of people with nothing to eat. The famine that followed in 1921 and 1922 killed an estimated 5 million people, concentrated in the Volga region. Sailors at the Kronstadt naval base, men who had been among the Bolsheviks' own strongest supporters just a few years earlier, mutinied in March 1921, demanding economic reform. Lenin understood what that mutiny meant. If the regime kept squeezing the peasantry through outright confiscation, it wasn't going to run out of grain first. It was going to run out of consent. So in March 1921, Lenin reversed course and introduced the new economic policy. And the pivot is worth sitting with, because it tells you something true about Soviet economics for the entire following decade. Ideology bent when the numbers stopped working. The NIP replaced forced requisitioning with a fixed tax in kind, letting peasants sell whatever grain was left over after paying it on an open market. Small-scale private trade and small workshops were legalized again. The state kept its grip on what Lenin called the commanding heights of the economy: heavy industry, banking, large-scale foreign trade, but underneath that, something close to an actual market was allowed to breathe. It worked, in narrow economic terms, remarkably well. By around 1926 and 1927, both industrial and agricultural output had climbed back to roughly their 1913 levels. An extraordinary recovery from a country that had just lived through a world war, a revolution, a civil war, and a famine. But NEP created its own new problem, one that would define the argument inside the Communist Party for the rest of the 1920s. Manufactured goods stayed relatively scarce and expensive, while grain, once the harvests recovered, became relatively cheap and abundant, a mismatch contemporaries called the scissors crisis, because a graph of the two price lines looked like an opening pair of scissor blades. Peasants had less and less incentive to sell grain to the state at prices that couldn't buy them much of anything in return, and a class of small traders and manufacturers nicknamed nepmen were visibly getting rich in a country that had just fought a revolution against exactly that. To Stalin, consolidating power after Lenin's death in 1924, this looked less like a temporary retreat and more like a slow drift back toward capitalism, and it was too slow to build the one thing he actually wanted: an industrial base capable of surviving a war with the capitalist world he assumed was coming. This is where the Soviet economy stops looking like an improvised emergency response and starts looking like an actual designed system. And the design center of that system was an institution called Gosplan, the State Planning Committee, beginning with the first 5-year plan. In 1928, Gosplan's job was to do something no government had ever tried to do at this scale: replace the price mechanism with direct physical planning. Instead of factories deciding what to produce based on what would sell at a profit, the state set physical output targets. So many tons of steel, so many tons of coal, so many tractors, and assigned those targets down through ministries to individual factories, using a method economists later called material balances. Work out how much of each input the whole economy needed, work out how much was available, and try to reconcile the two on paper before the year began. There was no real market to check whether any of this actually reflected what people needed or wanted. Prices were set administratively, often held artificially low or high for political reasons that had nothing to do with scarcity. A factory manager's job was not to make money. It was to fulfill the plan, a target usually measured in a single crude unit, tons produced, meters of cloth, number of units, which created a very specific and very predictable set of distortions. If your quota was measured in tons, you had every incentive to make things heavier than necessary. If it was measured in units, you had every incentive to make cheap, defective ones fast. Soviet enterprises operated under what the economist Janos Kornai later called a soft budget constraint. An unprofitable, badly run factory wasn't allowed to go bankrupt, because bankruptcy wasn't part of the plan. The state simply covered the loss and moved on. That single design choice, removing the possibility of failure, is arguably the deepest structural flaw in the entire system, and it would still be there unresolved 60 years later. The rationing system itself is worth pausing on because it shows how the planned economy actually behaved whenever the numbers didn't add up, which was often. Bread and other basic goods were rationed through card systems in the cities from 1929, abolished once in 1935 as agriculture stabilized, reintroduced immediately when the German invasion hit supply lines in 1941, and not lifted again until 1947. A ration card wasn't a sign the system was working. It was the visible seam where a plan that had promised a certain amount of bread met a harvest, a rail network, or a factory that hadn't delivered it. And the state's answer, again and again across 7 decades, was not to let the price rise and let the market sort out who needed bread most, but to hand out a fixed, equal, and usually inadequate allotment and manage the queue. Where did the money and the manpower for the first 5-year plan actually come from? This is the part most retellings skip, and it's the actual engine of the whole story. Industrializing a poor agrarian country, fast, without foreign loans, and without a colonial empire to extract from, meant extracting the investment capital from somewhere inside the Soviet Union itself, and the only large surplus available was in the countryside. Stalin's answer was collectivization, forcing tens of millions of independent peasant households onto collective farms, kolkhozes, and state farms, sovkhozes, where the state could set delivery quotas directly and take the grain at prices it decided, cutting out the market bargaining that NAP had allowed. In theory, this let the state extract a controllable agricultural surplus to feed industrial workers and export for hard currency to buy foreign machinery. In practice, forced collectivization between 1929 and 1933 provoked ferocious peasant resistance, families slaughtering their own livestock rather than hand it to the collective, and the state responded with a campaign to liquidate the kulaks as a class, deporting hundreds of thousands of families, by some estimates well over 1 million people, to remote regions under brutal conditions. Combined with impossibly high grain quotas that stripped entire regions of their food supply even as the government continued exporting grain abroad to fund industrial imports, the result was a catastrophic famine in the winter of 1932 and 1933. Britannica's estimate puts the toll at 4 to 5 million deaths in Ukraine alone, and another 2 to 3 million across the North Caucasus and the lower Volga. A death toll historians continue to debate in its exact scale, but not in its basic cause: a state that prioritized grain exports and industrial targets over the survival of the people growing the grain. This is the uncomfortable, unavoidable fact sitting underneath Soviet industrialization. The capital for the tractors and steel mills was, to a very real extent, extracted from the starved bodies of Soviet peasants. What that capital and forced labor actually built, though, was genuinely enormous, and this is the other half of the story that a purely moral accounting can miss. Entire industrial cities were conjured out of open steppe. Magnitogorsk, built from 1929 onward next to iron ore deposits in the southern Urals, grew from essentially nothing into one of the largest steel complexes in the world, staffed partly by exiled kulaks and partly by workers who genuinely believed they were building a new civilization. The Dnieper hydroelectric dam, the largest in Europe when it was completed in 1932, electrified an entire industrial region. According to figures compiled by the New World Encyclopedia, coal output rose from 35.4 million to 75 million tons, and iron ore from 5.7 to 19 million tons during the plan period. And the official claim was that the plan's industrial targets were fulfilled at nearly 94% in just 4 years, with heavy industry alone exceeding its goal. Soviet officials at the time claimed even higher year-on-year growth figures, numbers Western economists have generally treated as inflated, produced by a reporting system in which every level of management had a strong incentive to tell Moscow what Moscow wanted to hear. But even discounting the propaganda, independent Western reconstructions still show real, substantial industrial growth through the 1930s. This is the core trade-off of the entire Stalinist model in miniature, a system that could not tell you honestly whether a factory was profitable, could still, with enough coercion and enough sacrificed lives, move mountains of steel and concrete exactly where the state wanted them. The instrument used to enforce all of this, and to keep supplying labor to remote construction sites nobody would volunteer for, was the Gulag, the state's rapidly expanding network of forced labor camps. It's worth being precise here too, because the popular image of the Gulag as the secret engine that single-handedly built Soviet industry doesn't hold up well against the economic evidence. The camp population grew enormously through the 1930s, and peaked at around 2.5 million prisoners in the early 1950s, and prisoners genuinely built major infrastructure, most famously the White Sea-Baltic Canal, dug largely by hand by a workforce that at times exceeded 100,000 people and finished at brutal human cost in barely 2 years, only for the finished canal to prove too shallow for most of the ships it was meant to carry. But research using Soviet planning archives, most notably by economic historians working through the Hoover Institution's Gulag project, has found that at its peak, the camp system accounted for something like 2% of the Soviet labor force and a roughly comparable, similarly small, share of national income. A real but modest contribution once the enormous costs of guarding, transporting, and constantly replacing a starving, poorly motivated workforce are factored in. The Gulag was not the hidden secret that made Soviet industrialization possible. It was a genuinely vast human catastrophe that the economy carried, at a real and measurable cost, rather than one it was secretly built on. And it's worth being precise about what actually happened, because both the heroism and the mechanics of it are real. When Germany invaded in June 1941, the occupied and threatened western regions of the USSR held a staggering share of its pre-war productive capacity, by some estimates roughly 2/3 of pre-war output capacity, including the majority of its coal mines, steel and aluminum production, and aircraft manufacturing. The Soviet response was one of the largest logistical operations in industrial history. Beginning in the summer of 1941, the state organized the relocation of over 1,500 major factories, along with an estimated 10 to 16 million workers and their families, eastward across the Urals into Siberia and Central Asia, loaded onto well over 1 million railway wagons, often reassembled and producing weapons again within weeks of arrival, sometimes in the open air before the walls of the new factory buildings had even gone up. The human cost of this transition was severe. Soviet GDP fell by roughly 1/3 between 1940 and 1942, and industrial production in some sectors dropped by half. But by 1943, according to multiple wartime production comparisons, Soviet factories, most of them now the relocated ones east of the Urals, were outproducing Germany in tanks and aircraft, churning out the T-34 tank and Yak fighters in numbers the more sophisticated but slower German war economy couldn't match. American Lend-Lease aid mattered here too, and it's worth being honest and specific about how much. The United States delivered roughly $11 billion in aid to the Soviet Union across the war: trucks, aircraft, food, industrial equipment, and most historians estimate it made up somewhere between 4 and 10% of total Soviet wartime resources. Genuinely useful, especially in trucks and canned food that eased chronic bottlenecks, but a clear minority share next to what Soviet industry produced domestically. The wartime Soviet economy, in other words, is the single clearest proof of what the centrally planned system was actually good at. Given a single, unambiguous, existential target and near total authority to direct every resource toward it, it could mobilize labor and material at a speed and scale that a market economy, with its need to coordinate millions of independent decisions, would have struggled to match. Peace did not bring relief. It brought brought a new, permanent version of the same wartime logic, because the Cold War that began almost immediately after 1945 meant the Soviet leadership never fully stood down from a war footing. Post-war reconstruction rebuilt shattered cities and restarted the five-year plans, but an ever larger share of the country's industrial capacity was now permanently earmarked for what became known as the military-industrial complex, an entire parallel economy of defense ministries, closed weapons-designed cities, and enormous research institutes that received first claim on the country's best scientists, best engineers, and best raw materials. Western intelligence estimates, compiled by the CIA and defense analysts through the Cold War, put Soviet military spending at somewhere around 15 to 17% of Soviet gross national product by the mid-1980s, and some scholars working from declassified Soviet archives after 1991 have argued the true figure may have been higher still. The Kremlin itself spent decades actively concealing the real number. When Gorbachev finally published an official military budget figure in 1989, 77 billion rubles, it was roughly 4 times larger than what Soviet officials had previously admitted to, and even that revised figure was still widely believed in the West to understate the truth. This mattered enormously for ordinary Soviet life, because every ruble, every ton of steel, and every engineering graduate absorbed by a missile design bureau or a submarine yard was a ruble, a ton of steel, and a graduate that did not go toward building apartments, shoes, or washing machines. The Soviet Union could put a satellite into orbit in 1957 and build enough nuclear warheads to match the United States missile for missile, while its own citizens waited years on housing lists. And this is where the everyday economic experience of Soviet citizens comes into focus, because the same system that could build Sputnik was chronically, structurally unable to reliably stock a grocery store. Agriculture kept generating exactly this kind of cycle for the rest of Soviet history, and the clearest post-war example is Nikita Khrushchev's Virgin Lands campaign. Chronic grain shortfalls after the war convinced Khrushchev, who took over after Stalin's death in 1953, that the fix wasn't more coercion, but more land. Plow up tens of millions of hectares of previously uncultivated steppe in northern Kazakhstan and western Siberia and grow wheat on it. Mobilized largely through Komsomol youth brigades sent out in a burst of genuine, well-documented enthusiasm, the campaign expanded Soviet-sown acreage by around 46 million hectares between 1954 and 1960, and in its best year, 1956, grain output across the newly cultivated regions came in roughly 180% above the pre-campaign average, pushing the whole Soviet Union to its largest harvest in its history up to that point. For a few years, it looked like a genuine solution to a genuine problem. Then the hidden cost arrived, in the form of the land itself. Much of the virgin steppe wasn't well suited to repeated grain cultivation without proper crop rotation or soil conservation, and instructions from the center to keep sowing wheat, and more wheat, rather than let land rest, led to soil erosion and increasingly wild swings in yield from one year to the next. A serious drought could now wipe out a much larger share of the total harvest than before the campaign began, and yields on the new land began declining after 1959. Virgin lands never repeated its 1956 peak. It's a small, contained version of the entire Soviet economic pattern. An urgent problem, a bold, centrally directed solution, an impressive early number, and a structural cost quietly building underneath it that nobody in the plan had been asked to price in. Consumer goods were treated, in planning terms, as a residual category, whatever capacity was left over after heavy industry and defense had taken their share, and because prices were fixed by the state rather than set by supply and demand, a shortage didn't show up as a rising price. It showed up as an empty shelf in a queue. Soviet citizens developed an entire informal economy to cope, built around a practice known as blat, a web of personal favors, connections, and informal trading that let people get scarce goods, a better apartment, a doctor's appointment, a pair of decent shoes, through who they knew rather than what they could officially buy. Housing was mass-produced but chronically undersized. Under Khrushchev in the late 1950s and 1960s, millions of families were moved out of shared communal apartments into small, prefabricated concrete panel buildings that Soviet citizens nicknamed Khrushchevkas, a genuine improvement in privacy that still left many families in cramped, hastily built units for decades. Attempts to fix the underlying incentive problem were made and repeatedly diluted. Premier Alexei Kosygin 1965 reforms tried to let factory managers respond partly to profit and sales, rather than only gross output, a small opening toward market signals, but the reform was rolled back under bureaucratic resistance within a few years. And the deeper problem, a system with no honest prices and no real threat of bankruptcy, was never actually solved. By the Brezhnev years of the 1970s and early 1980s, a period Soviet citizens themselves later called the era of stagnation. Growth rates that had once been genuinely impressive by international standards had slowed to a crawl, propped up increasingly not by rising productivity, but by exporting oil and gas at prices that, through most of the 1970s, kept climbing. That single dependency turned out to be the fuse. Soviet oil exports had become one of the regime's few reliable sources of hard currency, used to buy Western grain, technology, and consumer goods to paper over the planned economy's own shortfalls. In the mid-1980s, global oil prices collapsed, and Soviet export earnings collapsed with them, arriving at almost exactly the moment Mikhail Gorbachev took power in 1985 and launched Perestroika, a package of reforms meant to restructure and revive the same economy without abandoning central planning altogether. It was, structurally, an impossible balancing act. Gorbachev's reforms loosened state control just enough to let enterprises negotiate their own supply deals and let a limited number of cooperatives operate legally without ever fully freeing prices or truly hardening the budget constraints on failing state firms. The result was the worst of both systems at once. Planning discipline broke down faster than market discipline could take its place. Goods that used to flow, however inefficiently, through the plan now vanished into new legal gray markets, or simply stopped moving, while the state budget deficit widened sharply, worsened by falling oil revenue, the costly war in Afghanistan, and an anti-alcohol campaign that had, almost accidentally, wiped out one of the government's biggest sources of tax revenue. Shelves that had been merely inadequate for decades became, by 1990 and 1991, genuinely, visibly empty in a way that shocked even citizens accustomed to shortages. When the Soviet Union formally dissolved in December 1991, it wasn't because an invading army broke through a border. It was because a planning system with no honest prices, no bankruptcy, and a military burden it never fully disclosed even to itself had spent decades borrowing against a future productivity gain that never arrived. And the bill, when the oil money that had been quietly covering it finally dried up, came due all at once. So what actually was the Soviet economy underneath the ideology on both sides of the Cold War telling you what to think about it? It was a specific machine, built first out of emergency and later out of deliberate design, for concentrating an entire nation's labor and resources under a single central authority and pointing them at whatever target that authority chose, with almost no regard for cost, for consumer welfare, or for the human beings the resources were extracted from. When the target was pure output at any human price, tons of steel, tank divisions, orbital satellites, that machine could move faster and further than almost anything history had seen. When the target required something the machine had never been built to measure, an honest price, a satisfied customer, a factory allowed to actually fail, it had no answer at all. The Soviet Union did not lose the Cold War on a battlefield. It lost it to its own accounting, an economy that had learned brilliantly how to build a superpower and never learned how to run a grocery store.